Optimizing images for websites, social media, and print. So where you post the image has important implications on how it's going to look. Every screen actually interprets an image differently and presents it differently. All we can do is make sure that the image that we've got is as close to the standard as possible, and therefore the variation across many screens will at least be around a good standard. So let's talk about those platforms, and each platform has different technical requirements. So if we're going on the web, we need to optimize for that. The most important thing for websites is the speed at which they load. If they load too slowly, it's going to put people off, they're going to leave, and it's going to affect their search optimization ranking. So ideally, we want to make sure our images are as small as possible while still retaining quality. Then there's social media platforms. Now, obviously, when you hear that, you think, well, they're just websites too, but they have their own protocols. And we need to make sure that we optimize our exports for their protocols. Otherwise, if we export them incorrectly, they're going to show up worse on those formats. And then finally, there's print. Now, print's quite complicated, more complicated than it is posting for the web. Each printer has its own printer color profile. And in fact, it uses entirely different color space, where screens work on light, which is an RGB format, which is red, green, blue, the three constituent colors of light. Printers work on a different format, color space called CMYK, which means cyan, yellow, magenta, and black. And that's because they're ink-based, or some of them are laser-based. As a result, when we export our images, we need to make sure that we get the correct color space for where they're going to be exported. Now, there's a few other considerations. We might actually want to edit our images differently depending on the platform they're going on. If we know there's a particular trend that we're looking to achieve for, say, Instagram, we might want to do an edit independent for that platform. Another thing to consider is the use case. Maybe we know that the image is going to be used with some graphics. Potentially it's going to be on the front of a magazine. And as a result, we need to leave some space around the edges of the image. Therefore, we might need to export it at a different size with some negative space. Then finally, maybe we're exporting an image for a billboard. They're horizontal generally. So we want to make sure that the image is exported in a horizontal format. We might need to crop it appropriately for that. But it might also be using for a digital poster board, and they tend to be portrait. So we need to make sure that we export appropriate for that format. Now we're going to look at the specifics of exporting later on. The first thing we want to talk about is file format. There's many different types of file formats. There's literally hundreds for imagery. There's only really 5 that you need to know. And if you ever encounter any of the other formats, you've probably gone wrong, or hopefully you're so advanced that anything that I'm telling you now isn't relevant. So a file format is basically the way in which data is packaged. There are 2 major distinctions. There's lossy and lossless. Now, the difference is that one of them retains all data, that's lossless, and the other is lossy. And that's where some data has been deleted and the image is being compressed. Now, why would we ever want the one that's being compressed? That image is a smaller file size. A lossless and lossy image could look exactly the same. But a lossless image is much better for editing, whereas a lossy image should be the final version. Let's look at the most common file types. We're going to start off with what I'm going to describe as the lossy formats. Now, the most famous format you've probably heard of is JPEG. JPEG is the most popular file format for imagery in the world. The benefits of JPEG is that it's a smaller size file, which makes them fast to upload, download, and share. They're universally compatible because they're the most popular file format. Basically, every piece of software that could interpret images can interpret JPEGs. They have great visual quality for their size, which makes them perfect for web and social media. Now, one thing we can do is we can actually set the camera to take JPEGs for us, so it compresses them and bakes them in on the camera, and that way we can quickly upload them without any editing required. Another feature of JPEGs is that if we're using advanced editing tools, we can actually make a decision about how compressed the JPEG is going to be. Okay, so what are the actual drawbacks of JPEGs? Well, as I said before, JPEGs are lossy. So if we're expecting to edit them again, you're going to lose data. Also, on top of that, if we open a JPEG and edit them a little bit, say we needed to delete a logo from them, and then save it again, because it's lossy, we actually degrade the quality of the image. You can't keep saving JPEG over and over. If you keep saving a JPEG over and over again, each time it gets compressed and we lose data. And then one of the final key issues with JPEG is that they don't support background transparency. So if we cut our product out of the middle of the image and we want a transparent background to go on a website, so we can scroll up and down and maybe graphics will move behind it, it's actually not viable with JPEGs. So when should we use a JPEG? So the most appropriate time to use JPEG is when we know this is the final version of the image and we're ready to post it online or wherever it is. JPEG is one of the 2 formats that's best also for print. You can actually create large size JPEGs that don't have too much that though they're compressed, they retain all the information that's required for a good quality print. Now, the next file format we're going to look at is very similar to JPEG. It's kind of the new kid on the block, and it's called WebP. Now, the benefit of WebP is that it's about 25 to 30% smaller than a JPEG, but the quality that it offers is about the same. It also supports transparency, so it makes it great for working with graphics and logos, or where we don't want to have a background. Further to that, it even supports animation. So if we want to create GIFs or short graphic animations, WebP is a fantastic file format for that too. And interestingly with WebP, it offers both lossy and lossless file formats. It's incredibly versatile. So when should we be using WebP? So we want to use it on a website for when we're trying to improve loading speeds and SEO, in mobile apps to reduce the storage on the actual app, basically anywhere where we want high quality imagery but low size. Now, the big problem with WebP is compatibility issues. Because it's a relative newcomer, it's still gaining traction, and as a result, not everywhere supports exporting it, and not everywhere supports hosting it. But the good news is that all browsers do support it. The other thing WebP is not great for is for print. I would stick with JPEG. Then there's PNG. Now, PNG is similar in a lot of ways to JPEG and different in others. PNG is a lossless format. That means it retains all of the data. Another interesting thing about PNG is it supports transparency. Now, what's particular about PNG is that it's very good for graphics and illustration. Now, this might not seem that relevant for us as a photographer. If we're exporting an image that includes graphics, potentially a logo within the image, in that scenario, I would always choose PNG because PNG is the best at representing those. What are the drawbacks of PNG? Well, the major drawback with PNG is that the images that it produces are quite large. It's not as efficient with data as JPEG. As a result, I would only use it in special cases, in particular where I need transparency or where I know there's going to be graphics. Place it again that isn't suitable for is print. File type formats. Let's talk about the next section of file format. RAW. RAW is entirely uncompressed file format. It is also lossless. So you might be thinking, okay, well, why do I need a RAW format when I can just have a lossless PNG format? Well, here's the difference. Lossless PNG formats, though they retain data, they're not very flexible in editing. A RAW format actually has all of the data that came from the sensor when the camera took the picture. A PNG does not retain that much latitude. So we want a RAW image in the editing phase because it offers us maximum flexibility. So what we want to do is make sure that we actually set the camera up to be shooting in a RAW file format. You might have seen some incredibly nerdy t-shirts and merch around with people saying, I shoot RAW. This is why. Now, there are three major file formats with RAW. There is .raw, .tiff, and .psd. We're going to talk about all three of those. But let's just talk a little bit more about the way a camera works so we can get an understanding of RAW. So what the camera does is when it captures an image, it takes in more data than it shows you. It shows you what it thinks is a neutral representation. But if we're working with a raw image, we can take all of the data that the sensor gathered and then push that data in the edit. So this means without hurting our image too much, we can play around with the exposure, the highlights, the shadow, the white balance. It's vital for editing. If you know you're going to be editing your pictures, I know I've said it before, but you have to be shooting RAW. In terms of getting onto your camera, just Google how to shoot RAW. So what's the limitation of RAW? There's really only one limitation of RAW, but it is huge, and it's the file size. They can start at 20 megabytes, 40 megabytes, and they can go up to hundreds of megabytes depending on the camera. As a result, they're just not appropriate to be posted online. It's perfectly fine because all of the editing software, in order to get it off there, will encourage us to export it. And it's also not universally supported. There's one final complication with RAW, and for what feels like no good reason, every camera brand has their own version of RAW. I shoot Sony, and that's a RAW. Fujifilm camera is a different RAW. It doesn't really matter, but it's just whenever you see the file format extension and it's different than RAW, just know that it's your camera brand's name for it. The most common RAW format is .dng. This is the industry standard format. If you use Lightroom, Adobe will probably turn your camera's RAW images into .dng RAW images. DNG images are better basically just because the way in which software interprets them is a bit more consistent. Okay, so let's talk about the two specific RAW file types. There's PSD and TIFF. So TIFF is a RAW file format, can maintain all of the sensor data in it. It can be lossless, which means there's no compression. And importantly, it supports layers and transparency. Now, this is the big difference between the RAW that your camera produces and these next two formats. These next two formats are intended for photo manipulation and photo editing. What a TIFF file enables us to do is take many images together and stack them on top of one another and actually build in different adjustment layers. Now, we learned about these in the editing software. Another benefit of TIFF is that it supports high bit depth. This is really important if you're doing advanced color editing. It can display a lot more colors than a standard screen can. Compatible with both Mac and Windows, and it's ideal for high resolution printing. And there are a few limitations. You can't have any interactivity with it, nor animation. Okay, so then there's one last format that we're going to talk about, and that's PSD. Now, PSD has all of the benefits of TIFF, but it isn't quite as compatible. PSD stands for Photoshop document, and that's because it's intended for the use in Photoshop. So it supports layers. It's great for editing and retouching. We can keep going back and forth, sending it to designers as they add more to it, but there are a few drawbacks. Because it is intended for Photoshop, other platforms can open it, but there's limitations in what they can do with it. File sizes are obviously huge, and again, it's not ideal for quick sharing or web use. If you know you have work to do in Photoshop, I would always save it in PSD because it gives you a little bit more flexibility with certain things than TIFF. Let's recap that last section. JPEG is the go-to format for web and print. It's high quality but lossy, which means it's compressed. WebP is a newer format. It's similar to JPEG, except that it's smaller for the same level of quality. It can be both lossless and lossy, and it even offers transparency and animation. The big drawback with WebP is that it has a few compatibility issues because it's relatively new. PNG is a lossless format, and it's most appropriate for where we need transparency in the background or where there's going to be graphics included with the image. It's not great for images alone because it's quite a large format. RAW files. RAW files are different than lossless in that they retain all of the sensor data from the camera. This gives us a lot of latitude in our editing. Each camera brand tends to have its own RAW file format. Shoot in RAW when latitude in editing is important. Then there's TIFF. TIFF is a relatively universal RAW format which enables us to add layers. Great for adjustments and working with teams. Then there's PSD. PSD is very similar to TIFF, except that it offers us a little bit more flexibility in Photoshop, but is worse for its compatibility.